Becker was born in Springfield, Massachusetts on September the 27th, 1924, the son of first-generation Jewish immigrants. His family, his parents, and his brother Louis were not strictly Orthodox Jews, but the parents in particular were observant. And there's no doubt that this had an effect on Becker. His somewhat small, at that time, nuclear family was complemented and extended because of the presence in the same community of several aunts and uncles, and he had lots of cousins. So he really lived within an extended family as he was growing up. Ernest's father, Sam, ran a dairy, a kind of corner store, if you will, in Springfield, and was very successful at that. So much so that he was able to help finance some of the education and early career opportunities for his siblings. I believe, I'm not certain, but I believe that he was the oldest in his family. Many of the siblings became professionals, a couple of lawyers and so on and so forth. And the irony was that despite his having made all of this possible in a certain sense, Becker as a child thought that in certain respects his dad was not given the kind of recognition that he ought to have had. His mother was an interesting person. There's little known about the family, at least by me and anyone else that I've talked with. But she was an entertainer, and she would occasionally entertain at the Jewish Community Center. And she would sing, and she was almost a vaudevillian in a certain way. So she had a very outgoing personality. She was witty, and it's possible that Becker's rather caustic and understated wit perhaps had some origins in that context. More importantly, particularly with respect to his theorizing, and especially as it relates to human evil, is that the family was, of course, connected to relatives in Europe during the build-up to the Second World War and during the Second World War. Becker himself served in the U.S. Army as an infantryman, and he, I think, was actually of legal age. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the fall of 1942, Becker found himself on ground as a foot soldier early in 1943. And while in Europe from 1943 to 45, he saw firsthand a lot of the devastations of war. He's reported to have participated in the liberation of one of the concentration camps, although I haven't been able to determine exactly which one. He did not spend a lot of time following the war talking about his war experiences, but those people that knew him best, his friends, and there were many friends, both professional and others, believe that it affected him greatly, his experience at that time. There are diaries that he kept, and those are in the Becker papers at Columbia University. They're very difficult to interpret. It's almost as if he has written them, those of you who have seen them, in a kind of quasi-poetic, idiosyncratic way that communicates deeply to himself. If a person could ever break the code, I think that would be really a useful part of your biographical work, Greg, there's no doubt. After the war, his experience changed rather dramatically in that with the aegis of the GI Bill, he was able to obtain an undergraduate degree, a BA in anthropology from Syracuse University. And he completed that and was awarded his degree in 1950. Shortly thereafter, he was positioned as an administrative officer at the U.S. Embassy in Paris from about 1952 to 1956. And here again, he's directly involved in post-war, Cold War now, realpolitik. So this is a little more distant from his experience in the Army, but it nonetheless puts him in direct, immediate touch with events that are happening and the unpleasantness of those events, the tensions of those events, and so on and so forth. He probably did work for the CIA briefly and at a quite low echelon level. And there are reports of him meeting with the counterpart, a Russian counterpart in the Tuileries Gardens, exchanging small talk and perhaps small bits and pieces of information. So again, the point in mentioning that is to highlight the extent to which Becker was fully aware, or as fully aware as probably most people were at that time, and more than most, of the events, political events, the social cultural events internationally and nationally. He spoke absolutely perfect French and could write in French. So he was a multicultural person. He had aspects of the Renaissance person about him. When he returned to the United States from the stint in Paris, he pursued a PhD in cultural social anthropology at Syracuse University once again. His thesis director, his mentor there, was a person named Douglas Herring. And Douglas Herring is interesting because he was one of those individuals who consulted to the United States government both during the Second World War and in the Cold War, especially about Japan. Douglas Herring was a Japan expert, and he provided real guidance and help to the United States government in understanding the Japanese culture. And Becker got a lot of that indirectly. It's interesting that he does graduate with his PhD in cultural social anthropology from Syracuse University in 1960, but because of his war experience, because of his general maturity, because of his intelligence, he really doesn't complete certain major parts of the usual curriculum. He isn't, for example, required to do field work in the way that most, well, all other candidates for the doctorate degree did. And it was assumed that he'd already, under Douglas Herring's sponsorship, done his field work. He'd been in the army, he'd been in Paris and so on. And this also indicates something about Becker. Becker was not bashful about presenting himself and promoting himself as long as he felt that it wasn't his self that he was promoting in a narcissistic way, but the ideas that he was working toward. His first academic appointment was as an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at the Upstate New York Medical School, which actually was part of the State University of New York in Syracuse. It just is right across the street from Syracuse University, so it wasn't much of a trip to go there. What was interesting about this first appointment is that he worked directly with Thomas Sawes, the famous anti-psychiatrist. Some people would object to my use of that term. But Sawes, of course, was famous for his revulsion at the practice of involuntary incarceration of psychiatric patients. And Becker took on this cause himself to a certain extent. However, what led to Becker's dismissal from the State University of New York at Syracuse was not only his support of Sawes, but it was also his rather caustic manner. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and he let that be known. He made some rather penetrating remarks about some of the kind of research that was going on, and he didn't think it was quite getting at what it ought to be getting at, and people didn't appreciate this. Those of you who have been at universities, Phil, you'd understand this. But he was rather summarily shown the door. And so he was without a job after 2 or 3 years at SUNY Syracuse, and he moved again back over those 2 blocks into Syracuse University for a succession of what would now be called sessional lectureships, but in those days were called visiting professorships in both the departments of sociology and in anthropology. There were 2 separate departments at that time at Syracuse University, and he taught there. This time, he ran into difficulty with the authorities because of his opposition to corporate influence in the university. Becker was a consistent and staunch defender of academic freedom. And in reward for making that a obvious posture, he was dismissed. Then he was without any job, and at the urging of Irving Goffman, who had recently moved from a position in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, back to Pennsylvania, to the University of Pennsylvania, Becker got an interview at a distance from Berkeley and was appointed lecturer in sociology and anthropology at Berkeley. So at this time, he's married, his wife Marie, and their firstborn child, Samuel Stephen, pack up and travel across the country to the University of California, Berkeley, where Becker is a remarkably successful speaker, lecturer. He fills Wheeler Auditorium, which is multi-hundreds of seats. Most of the people that are attending, students and faculty, are not students, are not in the course. He teaches the course in a wide-ranging way as an attempt to understand our alienation at this time. Remember that this is in the 1960s. And he's talking about alienation from ourselves, from each other, from our society, from other people in our society, and also about alienation from God or the cosmos or whatever gives people grounding or has given people grounding in the past. And he covers all kinds of ground, traditional anthropology, sociology, but all kinds of other disciplines as well, social science where he can find it relevant, aspects of the humanities. He's very deeply and widely read. And he makes a real impact. He'll sometimes dress up, as Dan has reported, dress up as King Lear at an appropriate time to make a point. He's very dramatic. He can't be interrupted for half an hour before he goes, quote, on stage. And he is absolutely insistent that students reciprocate with their attention and with their work. And later at Simon Fraser, there are a couple of instances when this doesn't happen to his satisfaction, and Becker will just dismiss the class and leave and say, we'll try it again next time. So he's a very demanding teacher, but as Time magazine reported at this period, he eventually was dismissed at Berkeley because of his refusal to stay rather strictly within the disciplinary confines of sociology and anthropology. In particular, some people took offense at his insistence upon including various religious teachings, particularly Judaism, Christianity, in the course. So Becker finds himself then, now with a daughter joining the family of what's now 4 members, at 6s and 9s, and moves across the bay to the State University of California, San Francisco State College. A few years later, in 1973, it was upgraded to San Francisco State University, but it was San Francisco State College at that time. He works there for 1.5 academic terms, 1967-68, that academic term. And he starts the 1969 term, but by Christmas, Governor Reagan, Ronald Reagan, has sent in the National Guard to quell revolts, student uprisings, student demonstrations against the Vietnam War, against race relations in the United States. And Becker, quite pithily, in a letter to the president of the college in January of 1969, simply says, I tender my resignation because I find teaching in the presence of armed guards not conducive to the kind of atmosphere I'd like to cultivate with my students. Ernest Becker. And that's that. And he doesn't have a job. He has 2 children and a wife. And he's now really at 6s and 9s. And you can see from 2 quotations that are included in the handout his state of mind by an entry to a journal. This journal he didn't keep all the time, but he sometimes did. He was keeping it at this point. So a journal entry of December 10th, 1968 reads, "It is clear to me lately that I am masking my fear of finitude, of death, of being stupidly killed and ended, and my life having no real weight or meaning. But goodness, man, you have got to live on the world's terms like all flesh. You have got to travel on its roads and in its skies. You have got to take your insignificant place with all men. You have got to die. You have got to have only the tiniest weight in the destiny of man, if you have any weight at all. Then a few days later, a couple of weeks later, on December 30th, in a letter in response to an invitation from University of California, Davis to speak, this is just after he's been turfed by the University of California, Berkeley, which is the star crown in the California system. UC Davis comes calling and wants him to come and deliver a couple of lectures as part of a series that they're doing. And he responds thusly: "Your kind invitation catches me full in the middle of my 2-yearly ritual of looking around for another post to move myself and my family. I finally saw the apt analogy for my situation, namely that of the classy prostitute who is in great demand for an hour, but who no one would think of moving permanently into their home. I am sure that even prostitutes have their pride, and my policy is, if I'm not proper enough to take home, then no hour's pleasure either." He is probably depressed at this point in time, lashing out a bit. He is, I don't think, clinically depressed, but he is looking for a change. He's been at 3 different places. None of them have, well, in actual fact at 4, if you count both Syracuse and SUNY, which you ought. So he's been at 4 places in 8 years, and he's been shown the door at each one. And he is also experiencing students who he taught at Berkeley, who as soon as they've graduated have been drafted into the war. He keeps a correspondence with a couple of these people for quite a number of years. He also is meeting with a Wednesday evening group of people who are mostly theology students at Berkeley, and he continues to do that even after he takes the position at the University of California, University of San Francisco State College. So he's very well connected. He's not himself a radical, but he is very concerned about the war in Vietnam. He's very concerned about race relations. He's, in a way, he's kind of tired of the United States, at least that corner of it that he's occupying. And when finally Robert Harper at Simon Fraser University, who is a fan of Becker's, has read Becker's work, he directs a center in the Faculty of Education, a Center for Behavioral Foundations, knows that Becker is looking for a job, and convinces the university to check it out. All of this eventually leads to Becker signing a contract in March of 1969 to, as a tenured professor at Simon Fraser University, which, by the way, is hardly ever done at Simon Fraser University, not to give tenure or to promise tenure shortly after appointment. But they want Becker, and it's an interdisciplinary university. That's what it's not anymore, but at that time it's trying to be. And the department that Becker eventually lands in, the Department of Political Science and Sociology and Anthropology, is as interdisciplinary as it's likely to get. So Becker likes that. He knows a few people. He saw Saul Court, the Director of Continuing Education at the University of British Columbia, just across town in Vancouver. And he thinks he can make a go of it. And so he is delighted to move his family up to Vancouver at that time. He's not always as fond of the university as he is at that point in time, but he needs something and it seems to work for him, and he finds himself a bit of an outcast from mainstream US intellectual university circles, but at least at the beginning, quite happy to be one, although he's still, you see, what's burning him up is that he isn't getting the attention to his work that he thinks it ought to have. And this isn't just hubris. He really thinks he has something to say that would be helpful to many, many people. And he's convinced himself of this because he knows many people with whom he has talked at length, and they do get something out of this. So he feels that he's being ignored and he's being caught in a kind of, well, it's not a conspiracy theory, but he just hasn't found a place. So he's looking, he's searching.